In the year 1928, hidden deep within the mist of the Scottish Highlands, stood Dunmore Hall, a towering boarding school built of cold stone and darker secrets. To outsiders, it appeared as a place of strict learning and tradition, where children of wealthy families were shaped into proper citizens. But behind its ivy-clad walls, a ritual older than the school itself consumed every name, every life, every memory. At midnight, when the iron bell tolled 3 times, the fire beneath Dunmore stirred, devouring student records until even parents forgot their own children. To speak of it was forbidden, to question it was dangerous, and to resist was nearly impossible. Yet one girl, an orphan with nothing to lose and everything to uncover, dared to remember what others could not. This is not only the story of a school, but of a bargain sealed in fire, of children erased from history, and of a final night when silence was broken and the truth could no longer be buried. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The train groaned and hissed as it came to its final stop, its iron wheels screeching against the tracks before settling into silence. A heavy fog rolled across the platform, swallowing the lamps that flickered dimly against the highland mist. One by one, children stepped down from the carriages, their polished shoes clattering against the worn boards. Each carried a trunk, neatly painted with initials, symbols of families who had sent them away, some proudly, others reluctantly. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet earth, and the silence of the countryside pressed down on them like a weight. Through the veil of mist, Dunmore Hall revealed itself. At first, only the jagged tips of its turrets appeared, but as the fog shifted, the full silhouette emerged. A Gothic fortress of blackened stone stood against the pale Scottish sky, its towers twisted with ivy and its windows gleaming faintly, as though the building itself were watching. The children stopped in their tracks, their chatter fading into nervous whispers. Some tightened their grip on their trunks, while others stood rigid, unable to take their eyes off the looming figure of the school. A line of carriages awaited to carry them the rest of the way, their drivers silent men in dark coats who avoided eye contact. The horses snorted uneasily, their hooves striking against the gravel as though they too disliked the journey. The headmaster had not yet appeared, but his presence was already felt. Stories of him had traveled ahead of these students, whispered by older siblings and passing villagers. A man of rigid traditions, they said. A man who valued silence above all things. As the carriages rattled forward along the narrow road, the students caught glimpses of the surrounding landscape. The moors stretched endlessly, barren and gray, dotted with stones older than memory. A single crooked tree bent against the wind, and crows circled above as though summoned by the sound of the wheels. The children pressed their faces to the glass, each secretly wondering if this place would become their home or their prison. When the carriages finally rolled beneath the iron gates of Dunmore Hall, the building loomed larger than ever. Its stone walls seemed to breathe, its great oak doors etched with carvings too worn to read. Lanterns burned along the path, though no hand had lit them. The children climbed down, their steps hesitant, their breaths shallow in the cold air. The gates creaked shut behind them with a final, echoing clang. None of them knew it then. But from that moment forward, the walls of Dunmore Hall would decide who was remembered and who would be forgotten. The children were herded into the grand entryway of Dunmore Hall, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor. The air inside was heavy with the smell of wax and damp stone, as though the building itself had been sealed for centuries and only now awakened. Long rows of candles flickered against the walls, casting tall shadows that stretched across vaulted ceilings. At the far end of the hall, a man waited. His presence was enough to silence every whisper, every nervous shuffle. Headmaster Alistair Crowe stood tall, his back rigid, and his eyes sharp as glass. His black coat seemed too severe, his collar starched to an almost unnatural stiffness. With hands folded neatly behind him, he surveyed the new arrivals like a general inspecting troops. There was no warmth in his gaze, no trace of kindness. Only precision, expectation, and an unspoken command for obedience. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the chamber, measured and deliberate. "Welcome to Dunmore Hall," he said. "You will find that this school is not like others. Here, tradition is our foundation, order is our survival, and silence above all else is our virtue." The children exchanged nervous glances, but none dared speak. His words were not delivered as encouragement, but as law, carved into stone. He walked slowly down the line of students, his shoes tapping against the floor in a rhythm that felt uncomfortably final. Some lowered their heads when his gaze lingered too long. A few tried to meet his stare and quickly regretted it. By evening, the children were led to their dormitories, but sleep did not come easily. The sound of the great clock striking midnight rattled through the halls, a heavy iron bell that seemed to shake the walls themselves. At that very moment, deep below the school, another ritual unfolded. Hidden behind locked doors, in a chamber no student had ever entered, flames crackled within a stone hearth. A great iron furnace devoured paper, ink, and parchment. Each name of every new arrival written neatly into ledgers that same day was tossed into the fire. The heat consumed them until nothing remained but ash. By dawn, it was as though no record had ever existed. The children upstairs did not know this, but some stirred in their sleep, uneasy, as though their very names had been whispered into the fire. And in the silence of the chamber, Headmaster Crow stood alone, watching as the flames twisted and writhed. His lips moved in a ritual no one else could hear, and the fire answered with a hiss that sounded almost like breath. From that night forward, the children belonged not to themselves, but to Dunmore Hall. Life at Dunmore Hall quickly settled into a strange rhythm, though no one could quite call it normal. The children rose at dawn to the toll of the iron bell, their days filled with lessons in cold classrooms where the windows let in little light and the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. Yet it was not the strict schedule or the stern teachers that unsettled them most. It was the silence, the heavy, unspoken truth that lingered in every corridor, in every whisper cut short. Among the students, rumors spread like smoke. At first, they spoke in hushed voices about the missing twins from Edinburgh, though no one would admit to remembering their names. It was strange, almost impossible. 2 boys who had arrived only a week before were gone, their beds stripped, their trunks carried away. When asked, the teachers insisted that no such students had ever come through the gates. There were never twins here, they said firmly, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. And so the children began to understand the rule that was never written down, never spoken aloud by adults, yet always present. The older pupils knew it best. They warned the younger ones in whispers passed under blankets after lights out. Once your name was burned from the ledger, you were gone. Not gone in the way of running away, not gone in the way of being expelled, but erased, forgotten by everyone except those who dared to remember. Beds were reassigned, belongings disposed of, and soon even the faces blurred in memory, as if the school itself had stolen them. Some tried to soften the truth. They claimed the fire was a form of protection, a way to keep the children hidden from enemies beyond the gates. They said Dunmore Hall burned names to keep the students safe from something worse that lingered in the Highlands. But there were others, quieter still, who knew better. Their whispers held no comfort, only dread. The fire did not protect, it consumed. Each night, as the clock struck 12, the children felt it. A weight, pressing into their dreams. A sense of something slipping away. Some woke gasping for air, clutching their chests as though a hand had reached into their very being and taken something vital. And in the mornings, when a classmate's seat stood empty, no one dared ask why. The unwritten rule was not taught in lessons. It was carried in silence, etched into fearful glances, passed from one trembling voice to another. At Dunmore Hall, you did not speak of the missing. For the moment you did, you risked being next. The first night it came, the children thought little of it. A bell, after all, belonged to a school, and Dunmore Hall was old enough to have many rituals. But when the iron bell rang out at the stroke of midnight, its sound was unlike any other they had ever heard. It was not a clean, bright chime, but a deep, groaning toll that seemed to drag through the marrow of their bones. It echoed through the dormitories, rattling the bed frames and shivering across the window panes. The first toll fell heavy, the second heavier still, and by the third, every child lay wide-eyed in their bed, afraid even to breathe. The bell was not meant for them alone. Its sound traveled beyond the walls of Dunmore Hall, carried by the mist and the night air into the surrounding moors. In the nearby village of Blackthorn, shutters slammed at its echo. Lamps were snuffed out, and villagers crossed themselves quickly, muttering old words their grandparents had taught them. Not again. Please, not again. To those who lived in the valley, the midnight bell was not a call to order, but a warning. It meant the fire below Dunmore was hungry once more. Inside the school, the children whispered of its meaning. Some believed the toll marked the burning of the names in the ledger, each sound sealing the fate of another. Others said the bell kept something contained, as though its toll was the chain that held back a beast that stirred in the depths beneath the school. Whatever the truth, none could ignore the chill it brought, a sound that made their small world feel fragile and watched. One boy, braver than the rest, tried to laugh at it. "Just an old bell," he whispered into the dark, but his voice cracked halfway through. None of the others answered him, because they all knew that the silence following the third toll was worse than the sound itself. It was a silence that pressed against the ear, that felt deliberate, as though the night itself was holding its breath. By the second week, the new students had learned what the older ones already knew. When the clock crept toward midnight, you did not speak. You did not move. You lay still and prayed the bell would not remember your name. And so the nights passed at Dunmore Hall, each one sealed with 3 iron tolls. To the world outside, it was a sound to fear. To those within, it was the sound of being counted, weighed, and perhaps one night chosen. The news spread first in whispers, as all dark things did within Dunmore Hall. 2 beds lay empty in the east dormitory, the blankets neatly folded, the trunks vanished without a trace. The younger children noticed immediately, but the older ones warned them to keep quiet. To speak of the missing was to invite danger, yet the silence only deepened the dread, for everyone remembered the boys, their identical laughter, their matching uniforms, the way they had stood out as a pair among so many solitary children. The twins from Edinburgh had arrived only a week earlier, their polished shoes gleaming on the day of arrival, their hands gripping each other tightly as though to face the looming school together. They had been inseparable, even in the dining hall, whispering to each other when the headmaster's back was turned. And now, as if swallowed by the walls, they were gone. No explanation, no farewell, not even a trace of their names on the lips of the teachers. The disappearance could not be hidden from their family for long. Within days, a carriage rumbled up the long, winding road from the village, its wheels grinding against the gravel. A man and a woman stepped out, their fine coats marked by travel, their faces drawn with worry. They demanded to see their sons. Their voices echoed through the entrance hall, breaking the suffocating order that usually held the school in silence. The students lingered in corners, straining to hear, but most were quickly shooed away by staff. Headmaster Alistair Crow emerged from his study with the composure of a man entirely unshaken. The couple pleaded, their voices cracking with desperation. "Our boys," the mother said, her hands trembling. "They were brought here only last week. Where are they?" Her husband produced a letter with the school's seal, proof of enrollment. Crow regarded it coolly, his lips pressed thin. Then, in a voice devoid of sympathy, he answered, "There were never twins here." The words cut like a blade. The parents' protests grew louder, more frantic, but the headmaster did not falter. He summoned 2 teachers, who confirmed his statement without hesitation. No such boys had ever walked the halls of Dunmore. No such names existed in the records. The ledger, when presented, was clean of any trace. It was as though the twins had never lived. The parents left in grief and fury, their carriage wheels spitting gravel into the night. The children who witnessed it were left shaken, for they remembered the boys clearly. They remembered the laughter, the identical faces, the way the 2 had clung to each other. But as the days passed, even those memories began to blur, as if some unseen hand was erasing them one by one. By the next week, the younger pupils were asking quietly, "What twins?" And the silence of Dunmore Hall deepened once more. The dormitories of Dunmore Hall were long, narrow chambers with rows of iron-framed beds lined against the walls. At night, when the last lanterns were dimmed and the footsteps of the teachers faded down the corridor, the true voice of the school emerged. It was not in the classrooms or the chapel where its secrets lived, but in the fragile whispers traded between children under the cover of darkness. The older students carried those whispers like smuggled treasures, passing them carefully to the new arrivals. They spoke of names that once filled the roll call but no longer did, names that had been erased as though they had never belonged to anyone at all. They spoke of classmates who laughed at breakfast and were gone by supper, their beds stripped bare before the sheets had even cooled. Some told stories of portraits that once hung in the hallways, painted in honor of prize-winning students. They swore the faces faded over time, the colors dimming until the canvas showed only a blurred outline, and then nothing at all. "The school forgets them," one boy whispered to a trembling first year. "Not just the teachers, not just the ledgers, the very walls forget they ever lived here." There were those who claimed they could still remember. They clung to fragments of voices, a smile, the way someone once tied their shoelaces too tight, or the echo of laughter in the dining hall. But even those fragments were fragile, slipping away like mist. The more the children tried to hold on to the memory, the more it crumbled, as though some unseen hand was peeling it away piece by piece. It was in those moments, when silence stretched too long, that the younger ones would ask, "Why us? Why our names?" The older students never had answers, only warnings. "Do not speak their names in daylight," they said, their eyes darting toward the doors. "The teachers don't remember, and if they hear you, they'll make sure you forget too." And so, the whispers became the only resistance the children had. They whispered beneath blankets, mouths close to ears, voices barely audible above the sound of the wind against the windows. They whispered so the memories would not die completely, so that even if the school itself erased every trace, something small would survive. In that way, the dormitory became more than a place of sleep. It became the last sanctuary of memory in a school that sought to consume it. And as the iron bell tolled once more at midnight, the children lay awake, whispering into the darkness, terrified that one day, even their own names would be the ones carried only in secret. The library at Dunmore Hall was unlike any other room in the school. While the classrooms smelled of chalk dust and damp stone, the library carried the weight of centuries. Dust clung to the shelves like a shroud, and the tall windows, draped in velvet curtains, allowed in only the faintest slivers of gray Highland light. The air was thick, heavy with the musk of parchment and forgotten ink. Few students dared to spend much time there, for the librarian herself was as unsettling as the room she kept. Mrs. Kincaid was a tall, thin woman with eyes that seemed to notice everything, though she rarely spoke. Her hair was always pinned back severely, streaked with iron gray, and she moved silently among the stacks, as though she belonged to the shadows. The children whispered about her constantly. Some said she had been at the school longer than any of the teachers, that she had once been a student herself and never left. Others insisted she carried secrets no one else dared to keep, and that she alone remembered the names the school tried to erase. It was said she kept copies of the rosters, hidden deep within the archives behind her desk. Rosters that recorded every child who had ever walked the halls of Dunmore Hall. If anyone still held proof of the missing, it was her. One boy, restless with the torment of half-memories, decided to find out for himself. His name was Callum, a second-year student who had once shared a dormitory with the twins from Edinburgh. He still remembered their laughter in the evenings, still recalled how one of them had lent him a pencil his first day. He refused to believe they could be gone, as if they had never been. And so, when Mrs. Kincaid extinguished the lamps one evening and drifted away to her quarters, Callum crept into the forbidden section. The drawers were locked, but he pried one open with trembling hands. Instead of ledgers bound in leather, instead of lists of names neatly inked across pages, he found only ash, piles of it, fine and gray, spilling out onto his fingers. The scent was unmistakable, the acrid tang of something once burned. Drawer after drawer told the same story, filled not with records but with remains. Callum's heart pounded as he backed away, but before he could leave, he thought he heard a sound, a faint sigh, like breath against his ear, though the room was empty. The shadows seemed to shift, and for a moment he was certain the shelves were watching him. He fled before Mrs. Kincaid could return, but he carried with him the bitter truth. Whatever secrets the librarian once guarded had long since been surrendered to the fire. And if she remembered, she would never say. The older students spoke often of the archive chamber, though none had ever claimed to see it with their own eyes. It was said to lie far beneath Dunmore Hall, deeper than the cellars where food was stored, lower even than the tunnels that carried the smell of damp earth into the kitchens. The chamber was not on any of the maps pinned to the classroom walls, nor mentioned in lessons, yet everyone knew it existed. You could hear it if you listened closely enough. At night, when the bell tolled at midnight, the dormitories shuddered faintly, and from the cracks in the floorboards came sounds that could not be mistaken for wind or stone settling. The children spoke of the grinding of gears, a slow and deliberate turning, as though great machines hidden underground were being set in motion. Along with it came faint flickers of light, thin, shifting lines of orange that escaped through the gaps in the boards, as if the earth itself was glowing from beneath. No one spoke of these things in daylight, but in the long hours after curfew, the whispers filled the dormitories. Some said the fire was ancient, older even than the school, and that Dunmore Hall had been built directly above it to contain it. Others believed it was not fire at all, but something alive, something that needed to be fed, with names, with memories, with children. And then there were the cries. Those who had been at the school longest swore they had heard them. Muffled, faint, as though carried through stone, they would rise just after the first toll of the bell and fade by the third. It was not the cries of one child, but of many, layered atop one another, weaving together in tones of despair. Younger children pressed their pillows over their ears, swearing they would never listen again, while the older ones only grew more hollow, as though each cry stole something from them too. Some tried to explain it away. "It's the pipes," they said, "or the wind in the moors." But no one truly believed that. Pipes did not sound like pleading. Wind did not break your heart in the way those cries did. No teacher ever acknowledged the sounds. If a brave child mentioned them in class, the teacher's face would grow stiff, their eyes darting toward the windows as if afraid of being overheard. The subject was always changed, and punishment swiftly followed. Yet the children knew the truth in their bones. Beneath Dunmore Hall, the fire below burned every night. It devoured the names from the ledgers, erased the faces from memory, and, if the whispers were to be believed, carried with it the voices of those it had already claimed. And the bell tolled on, sealing the fire's hunger with every stroke. The autumn rain fell in relentless sheets the morning Isla McCrae arrived at Dunmore Hall. Her journey had been long, beginning in the crowded streets of Glasgow, where she had lived most of her short life in the shadows of factories and the echo of church bells. She carried no polished trunk with engraved initials like the others before her, only a small battered suitcase with fraying seams and a clasp that barely held shut. While the other children arrived with family escorts, Isla stepped down from the carriage alone. There was no one to wave, no one to look back at, and no one waiting for her return. She was an orphan, and the school seemed to sense it immediately. The matrons looked at her differently, their eyes lingering longer than they should have, as if calculating her absence would not trouble anyone outside these walls. Yet Isla stood straighter, clutching her suitcase with both hands, her jaw set in quiet defiance. If no one else would keep her alive in this place, she would do it herself. From the first night, Isla felt the weight of the midnight bell differently than the others. While the children around her shivered beneath blankets and whispered prayers, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the gears below and the faint cries woven into the fire's roar. There was something deliberate in the way the school erased its children, something purposeful, and Isla knew instinctively that if she was to survive here, she had to understand why. She began watching the teachers more carefully, memorizing the way their expressions shifted when a child disappeared. She noticed how quickly a bed was stripped, how swiftly a portrait blurred, how names never lingered in the roll call after the fire had taken them. And though she barely spoke to the other students at first, she listened. The whispers in the dormitory, the legends carried from older pupils, the fragments of truth passed like contraband, all of it fed her growing resolve. What set Isla apart was not only that she had no family to mourn her if she vanished, but that she refused to let herself become a name swallowed by the fire. While others trembled at the thought of being forgotten, Isla's fear hardened into something sharper. Curiosity, determination, a hunger for answers. By the end of her first week, Isla had already begun forming a dangerous thought. Perhaps the fire below did not only erase children, it depended on them. And if she was right, she might be the only one in Dunmore Hall stubborn enough, or desperate enough, to uncover the truth before it consumed her too. By her second week at Dunmore Hall, Isla McCrae learned that silence was not only expected, it was demanded. The rules of the school were not written on parchment or displayed on the walls, but carried in the clipped tones of teachers and the iron edge of their discipline. Questions were dangerous, and answers, when given, were more frightening than ignorance itself. It began innocently enough. A boy in Isla's class, no older than 12, raised his hand during roll call and asked why a name from the week before was no longer read aloud. The teacher, a pale man with hollow cheeks and eyes that never seemed to blink, froze where he stood. For a moment the room was still, the kind of stillness that makes even the air feel heavy. Then, without a word, the teacher's cane struck the boy's desk, splintering the wood. "Records," he hissed, his voice sharp as glass, "are not for children." The words were repeated again, slower, like an incantation. "Records are not for children." Oh. The boy was sent away, his seat empty by the next morning. No one dared to mention his name again. After that, Isla began to notice how often the phrase was spoken. Whenever a student dared to ask about the tolling bells, the glowing cracks in the floorboards, or the sudden absence of a friend, the reply was always the same. "Records are not for children." It was repeated with a uniformity that chilled her. Teachers said it with the same tone, the same cadence, as if the phrase itself had been drilled into them until it became more than a warning. It was a ritual, a chant meant to seal curiosity away. Discipline followed swiftly for those who pressed further. A girl who whispered in the dormitory about the missing twins was dragged by her ear to the courtyard and forced to kneel in the cold until dawn. Another boy, caught searching near the headmaster's study, was made to scrub the great stone staircase on his hands and knees until his skin was raw. The message was unmistakable. Silence was survival. And yet Isla, who had no family to grieve her disappearance, could not silence the questions burning in her heart. If records were not for children, then who were they for? Why did the phrase sound less like a dismissal and more like a prayer to something unseen? She held her tongue, nodding when teachers glared, pretending obedience when they demanded quiet. But in the stillness of the dormitory, while others pressed pillows to their ears against the midnight cries, Isla's eyes stayed open. She was listening, remembering, refusing to let silence swallow her whole. The first time Isla ventured beyond the gates of Dunmore Hall, the air felt different. The moors stretched endlessly, damp and windswept, carrying with them a sense of freedom that the school's stone walls denied. But even here, beyond the reach of the midnight bells, an unease lingered. The villagers who lived closest to the school watched her with wary eyes, as though she carried the weight of the place with her. She found herself in the small village of Braymore, little more than a cluster of cottages, a church, and a solitary inn where peat smoke drifted thickly from the chimney. The villagers were kind in gesture, offering her a seat by the fire or a cup of broth, but their kindness was wrapped in caution. Whenever she mentioned Dunmore Hall, voices fell silent, glances exchanged, and doors began to close. At first, Isla thought it was her imagination. But the longer she lingered, the clearer it became. The people here knew something. One old woman, her back bent with years, finally spoke in a voice as thin as paper. "The hall has stood longer than any of us can remember, child. My grandmother told me her grandmother whispered the same tales we speak now." Her cloudy eyes fixed on Isla. Each generation watches its carriages arrive, sees its students vanish, and none of us dare interfere. Another villager, a man with weathered hands stained from the peat bogs, leaned close. "It doesn't keep records," he murmured, "because it doesn't want the world to remember. The school trades memory itself. Children disappear, not just in flesh but in thought. What is forgotten becomes fuel." His face grew pale at his own words, and he refused to speak further. Isla pressed for answers. But no one offered more than fragments. Some crossed themselves when she mentioned the midnight bells. Others muttered old prayers under their breath, the kind one recites not for piety but for protection. The innkeeper, lowering her voice to a whisper, gave Isla the most chilling explanation of all. "It survives on what it takes, not just children, but the very memory of them. That is why the ledgers burn. That is why the cries echo through the moors. Something darker than stone and fire sustains that place." When Isla left Braemore and began the long walk back across the moors, the fog rolled in thick, curling around her ankles like smoke. She clutched her thin coat tighter and tried to ignore the growing dread in her chest. For the first time, she realized the villagers did not merely fear the school. They endured it, the way one endures a curse too old to break. And if they were right, Dunmore Hall was not only erasing children, it was feeding on them. The abandoned wing of Dunmore Hall was a place the teachers never mentioned, yet every student eventually heard whispers about it. It was said to stretch beyond the east corridor, behind a rusted iron gate that was always kept locked. But locks, like rules, were never enough to keep restless children from curiosity. One night, when the moonlight broke through the mist and the halls lay empty, Isla followed a group of older students who carried a stolen key. Their lanterns cast nervous shadows along the walls as the iron gate groaned open with a sound like a sigh from something long asleep. The air within was colder than the rest of the school, thick with dust that clung to their throats. Wallpaper peeled in strips from damp stone, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like veils. It smelled of mildew, paint, and something faintly metallic like old blood. They moved in silence, as though instinct told them that even a whisper might wake something listening. Then they saw the portraits. The hall stretched long and narrow, each wall lined with frames of varying sizes. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Children in school uniforms, stiff-backed and solemn, their faces painted with precise strokes. But as the lantern light swept across the canvases, unease settled into every heart. Many of the portraits were incomplete. A boy's face faded halfway into nothingness, leaving only a uniform floating in shadow. A girl's eyes were gone, two smudges of blurred paint where color should have been. Entire canvases were mottled with decay, as if time had chosen to erase the children rather than the frames. The deeper they went, the worse it became. Some portraits bore only faint outlines of heads, others nothing but blank canvas, surrounded by ornate gilded frames. Names etched on plaques beneath the pictures had been scratched away, leaving only scars in the brass. Yet the strangest thing of all was the sensation that the paintings were aware of their presence. The blurred eyes seemed to follow, the faceless outlines leaning closer with every step. One of the boys whispered, his voice trembling, "These were the ones no one remembers." The words struck Isla harder than she expected. She realized that these portraits had once been complete, each stroke painted with care, each face recorded. And then, just as the records burned in the fire below, the paintings themselves had been stripped of identity. The school was not only erasing names, it was undoing existence itself, layer by layer, until even art surrendered to forgetfulness. They fled before courage failed entirely, slamming the iron gate behind them. But that night, As Isla lay in her narrow bed, she could not rid herself of the thought that somewhere in that wing, a half-formed portrait of her might already be hanging, waiting for the moment her features, too, would blur into nothingness. The headmaster's study was a place few students had ever seen, and none willingly entered. It stood at the far end of the west corridor, its great oak door reinforced with iron bands that glistened in the dim lamplight. Isla had passed it many times before, each time sensing something behind it, like a heartbeat pulsing through wood and stone. That night, her curiosity outweighed her fear. She waited until the dormitory quieted, until the bell tower creaked with the weight of midnight, and then she slipped barefoot through the darkened halls, with nothing but a candle stub to guide her. The lock, to her surprise, yielded easily to the hairpin she had taken from her own braid. It was as if the door had been waiting to be opened. She pushed inside, and the smell of smoke and leather struck her at once. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose spines bore no titles, only strange symbols etched in faded gold. A heavy desk sat in the center, its surface gleaming under the faint light of her candle. Upon it rested the object she sought, a black, leather-bound ledger. The book looked ordinary at first glance, though the air around it felt charged, as though it breathed with a will of its own. Isla opened it carefully, and her heart thudded as she read the first page. Names. Dozens of them, written in ink so dark it seemed wet. Each was neatly marked with a date of arrival. But as her eyes traveled across the pages, she saw something stranger still. The names at the top were faded, so faint they were almost invisible, while those written more recently glared bold and sharp. She turned the page to find the same patterned bold ink near the bottom, fading into ghostly smudges near the top. She flipped further and realized with horror that the fading followed the rhythm of midnight. Names written strong and clear in the morning were already beginning to blur by evening, dissolving into paper fibers as though the ledger itself was drinking them dry. By the time the bell tolled 12, the names vanished completely, leaving behind only pale impressions, as if no child had ever existed. Her fingers trembled as she traced the empty spaces. There was no trace of the twins from Edinburgh, no record of the boy who had asked about roll call, no lingering mark of the girl punished in the courtyard. All gone, as though the ledger had swallowed them. Isla turned to the final page, her breath catching in her throat. At the bottom, written in bold, unyielding strokes, was her own name, Isla McCrae. The ink shimmered as though alive, pulsing faintly under her touch. And as the bell outside began its slow, heavy toll of midnight, she watched in terror as the first letter of her name began to fade. The post was one of the few connections the students had to the outside world. On rare mornings, a bundle of envelopes arrived, delivered by a weary rider whose face was always pale and tight with unease. The children gathered eagerly when their names were called, clutching letters from mothers and fathers, the words from home, a fragile thread of comfort in the oppressive silence of Dunmore Hall. But not every envelope was handed out. Some were carried away by the matrons, never seen again. Isla, sharp-eyed and suspicious, noticed this long before anyone else dared to speak of it. The truth revealed itself one bitter night, when she crept from her dormitory and followed the pale matron with the stooped shoulders. The woman moved quickly through the corridors, a bundle of unopened letters pressed tightly against her chest, as though she feared even the walls might pry into their contents. Isla kept her steps light, her breath shallow, until the matron descended the narrow stairwell that led deep beneath the school. The air grew hotter as Isla followed, the smell of ash and iron thickening with each step. At the bottom lay the archive chamber. Through the crack in the heavy door, Isla watched. A great furnace roared within, its flames licking high, casting grotesque shadows on the stone. The matron stepped forward, her face lit by the fire, and without hesitation she threw the letters into the blaze. Paper curled instantly, ink blackened, and words from desperate parents vanished in sparks and smoke. Isla bit her lip until it bled, holding back a cry. She recognized some of the names scrawled across the envelopes. The twins' parents. The boy who had once lent her a pencil. Mothers and fathers pleading for news, for confirmation, for any word of the children they had sent into Dunmore Hall's care. None of those letters would ever reach a child's hands. None would ever earn a reply. The fire consumed them all, as faithfully as it consumed the ledgers, as if the very act of remembering was forbidden. To acknowledge the missing would be to break the illusion. To answer a parent's question would be to admit a truth the school could never allow. When the matron left, Isla remained hidden in the shadows, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails cut crescents into her palms. She thought of her own parents gone long before she arrived, and felt a strange, hollow ache. Perhaps she was lucky, in a cruel way. There was no one left to write letters for her, no one left to have their words stolen by fire. But as she climbed back to the dormitory, Isla swore she would remember every name the flames tried to erase. If the school demanded silence, then she would be the one voice it could not burn away. The dormitory always felt colder in the hours before dawn, when the lamps were extinguished and the mist from the moors pressed against the windows like a living thing. Isla lay awake, listening to the breathing of the other girls, the occasional rustle of sheets, the faint groan of the timbers beneath them. Beside her, in the narrow bed pushed against her own, slept Elspeth, the only companion she had truly trusted since her arrival. Elspeth had a soft laugh that seemed out of place in Dunmore Hall, a stubborn streak almost as sharp as Isla's, and a habit of sneaking crumbs of bread from supper to share when the hunger became too much. They whispered often in the dark, careful to keep their voices low, binding themselves together against the shadow of the school. That night, Isla remembered Elspeth promising to teach her a lullaby her mother had once sung. Her friend's words had been light, hopeful even, as if both of them might forget for a moment the suffocating weight of the bells and the fire. But when Isla turned to murmur something more, the bed was empty. At first, she thought Elspeth had slipped away to the lavatory or wandered restless through the halls, as she sometimes did. Yet the minutes stretched on, and unease settled in Isla's chest like a stone. By morning, Elspeth's bed had been stripped clean. Her trunk was gone, the mattress already remade as though no one had ever slept there. The other girls stirred, yawning, tying their hair, chattering softly about lessons and chores. Isla waited for someone to notice, to ask, "Where is Elspeth?" But not a single voice spoke her name. When Isla herself dared to whisper it, the girl beside her only frowned in confusion. "Who?" she asked, tilting her head as though Isla had imagined it. A chill swept through Isla's veins. She tried again, louder, but the faces around her were blank. No recognition, no flicker of memory, only emptiness where friendship should have lingered. Even the teachers at roll call passed over the space where Elspeth's name should have been, their tones smooth and unbroken, as if no absence existed. Panic warred with rage in Isla's chest. She saw clearly what had happened, what the fire below had taken. Yet what unsettled her most was not Elspeth's vanishing, but the terrible realization that Isla alone still remembered. She could recall the sound of Elspeth's laugh, the secret songs she hummed, the warmth of a hand in the dark. No one else could. Not one person carried even the faintest trace of her friend. Why had the fire not stolen Isla's memory too? Was it because she was an orphan, with no family to surrender her name to forgetfulness? Or was it something deeper, something within her that resisted the school's curse? As she stared at the place where Elspeth's bed had been, she felt both the weight of her loneliness and a dangerous spark of defiance. If she could remember when no one else could, then perhaps she was not powerless. Perhaps she carried within her the very weapon the school could not extinguish. But that thought carried its own danger. To be the only one who remembered meant she bore the burden alone. Each erased face, each stolen name, would belong to her memory alone. Isla sat in silence, her fists curled in her lap, her gaze fixed on the empty space beside her. The morning bell rang, summoning the children to breakfast, but she did not move at first. She could still hear Elspeth's laugh in her ears, sharp and bright, refusing to vanish. And as she finally rose, she whispered a promise into the cold air. "I will not forget you." It was a vow the fire below could not burn away. The villagers of Braemore spoke in fragments, never daring to tell the whole of what they knew, but Isla had grown skilled at piecing fragments into something larger. Every warning, every whispered prayer, every fearful glance when Dunmore Hall was named, each carried part of the story. And slowly, it began to form a legend older than the school itself. One stormy evening, as rain battered the windows of the small inn, an old shepherd leaned across the table where Isla sat and lowered his voice. "It began long before our fathers' fathers," he said, his eyes flicking toward the door as if afraid the walls might hear. The year was 1645, when the plague devoured this land. Whole villages were emptied, the dead carted away by the dozens. Dunmore was no school, then it was a great estate, rich with tapestries and halls of feasting, but the sickness came even for them. The family begged the church for mercy, begged the crown for aid, but none could stop death's hand. He paused, his fingers trembling against his mug. So they turned elsewhere. Others in the inn shifted uneasily, but the shepherd pressed on. It is said the lord of the estate made a pact not with God, but with something that came from the fire. An entity that promised safety, promised the plague would pass them by. But there was a price. It did not hunger for flesh, nor for gold, but for what made a person who they were. Their name, their memory, their very place in the world. And so the fire was kindled beneath the hall, bound to the stones themselves, and it was fed. Isla listened, her skin prickling. The tale matched too closely what she had already seen, the fading names, the blurred portraits, the vanishing letters. The fire did not destroy alone, it consumed identity, piece by piece, until even grief itself was erased. The family survived, the shepherd whispered, while others perished. And when they built the school atop those cursed stones, the pact endured. Each generation has fed the fire, trading children for the illusion of safety. That is why no sickness touches Dunmore, why no famine ever empties its halls. It thrives, so long as it keeps paying. The inn had fallen silent, every villager listening, though none dared to interrupt. Isla's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and clarity. She finally understood. Dunmore Hall was not merely cruel, it was bound by something older than centuries. The fire below was not just flame. It was a mouth that had been fed for generations, a hunger disguised as tradition. And now it had her name written in its ledger, waiting for the moment she, too, would be consumed. The teachers of Dunmore Hall walked the corridors with iron discipline, their faces set in masks of control. To the students, they appeared as wardens, figures of authority who enforced silence and order with cruel precision. Yet as Isla watched them more carefully, she began to sense something beneath the surface. Their eyes carried a weight she recognized, not power, but fear. It was during an evening lesson that Isla first saw the truth slip through the cracks. The history master, Mr. Abernathy, was reading aloud when his voice faltered at the mention of a name in an old account. His gaze drifted toward the window, his lips parting as though another name unrelated to the lesson hovered just beyond reach. His hands trembled before he forced himself back to the page, his tone brittle, rehearsed. Isla realized then that he had remembered something he was not supposed to, only for it to vanish before he could hold it. Whispers among the students spoke of how even the teachers were not spared the fire's hunger. They remembered the first student they had lost their face, their laughter, their absence, but after that, the fire claimed even their grief. Year by year, memory by memory, their loyalty was reshaped not by choice but by emptiness. To resist was to risk being devoured entirely, and so fear became the chain that bound them to the school. One night, Isla overheard two teachers in the cloistered courtyard, their voices hushed but urgent. She hid behind the stone arch, her heart racing as their words drifted to her. "I see their faces in dreams still," one muttered, a woman whose stern expression had never once cracked in class. "The first ones, the others. I know they were there, but I cannot recall them. Only the fire." The other, a man with a limp and tired eyes, replied, "Do not speak of it. It listens. You know what happens if we question the bargain. We survive because we obey. We live because it takes them. instead of us. Their words chilled Isla to her bones. These were not guardians of knowledge, they were captives of the same pact, kept alive by surrendering the children entrusted to them. Their cruelty was not born entirely from malice but from terror, their loyalty nothing more than survival. The bargain had twisted them into accomplices, yet left them powerless to resist. For the first time, Isla understood why their voices rang hollow when they chanted, "Records are not for children." It was not merely obedience. It was a ritual of reassurance, a desperate attempt to quiet the fear that gnawed at them too. They were reminding themselves as much as the students, trying to hold fast to the thin illusion of control. As Isla returned to her dormitory, her mind reeled. The teachers were not the enemy she had imagined. They were prisoners, just as she was, perhaps even worse, for they had chosen long ago to accept the bargain, and now the fire erased their choices one by one until nothing remained. But Isla was different. She still remembered, and that made her dangerous. The chapel at Dunmore Hall had always unsettled Isla. Its high arched ceiling and colored windows cast strange fractured light that seemed less holy than haunting. Students were herded there for weekly services, forced to kneel on the cold stone floor while the chaplain delivered prayers in a voice that shook like brittle glass. Isla, however, paid little attention to the sermons. She kept her eyes fixed on the walls and floors, searching for secrets. Something about the chapel whispered of more than prayer. Her curiosity sharpened one evening when she noticed the floor beneath the pulpit. The tiles there were older, their grout cracked, the pattern broken where the rest of the stone was seamless. And when the choir sang, Isla felt the faintest breath of air rising from that spot, a draft far too warm to be the Highland wind. It carried with it the tang of smoke and iron. That night, when the corridors emptied and silence draped itself over the school, Isla slipped from her dormitory. With only a small candle to guide her, she crept to the chapel. The great wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, yet the vast room was empty. Her flame danced against the walls, throwing shadows into the carved saints who seemed to glare down in judgment. She moved to the pulpit, pressing her hands against the uneven tiles. To her astonishment, one shifted beneath her touch. She pressed harder, and the stone sank with a grinding sound. A narrow section of floor gave way, revealing a stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. The air that rose up was heavy with ash. She descended cautiously, the candlelight barely holding back the suffocating black. The stairs ended in a tunnel of stone, damp with age, lined with torches that had long since gone cold. She followed the passage until she heard the faint crackle of fire. Her pulse quickened. She was drawing closer to the heart of what she had only imagined. At the tunnel's end, a vast chamber opened before her. The ceiling was lost to shadows, but the center blazed with unnatural light. A pit of fire roared, and around it lay heaps of ledgers and scrolls, their pages curling and blackening as the flames consumed them. The ink hissed as it evaporated, rising in tendrils of smoke that writhed like living things. Isla stepped closer, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a cough. Then she saw it. Within the fire, something moved. Not a shape she could fully describe, but a presence. The smoke twisted into vague outlines, faces flickering, mouths opening and silent screams, only to dissolve again. The flames seemed to pulse with awareness, as though it had noticed her. She stumbled backward, her candle nearly extinguishing. The ledgers crackled louder, as if mocking her. Each book that fell into the flames released another hiss of memory, another fragment of life swallowed whole. And yet, through the smoke, Isla could almost hear whispers, voices of children, calling, pleading, begging not to be forgotten. Her chest tightened. This was the truth beneath Dunmore Hall. The chapel was no sanctuary, but a gateway to the bargain. The fire was not merely destroying records, it was feeding, and it was alive. Isla turned to flee, but before she could reach the stair, a deep sound rumbled from the pit, like laughter carried on the crackle of flame. She froze, every hair on her neck rising. The fire had not just seen her, it had recognized her. She ran, the passage closing around her like a throat, the echo of the fire's laughter chasing her all the way back to the chapel above. The night air inside Dunmore Hall was thick with dread. Isla felt it pressing down on her chest as she slipped through the corridors, the weight of every shadow heavy upon her. She had always known her time would come, but not so soon. Not like this. Earlier that evening, she had seen her own name etched in the black, leather-bound ledger on the headmaster's desk. The ink shimmered faintly, already beginning to fade as the cursed magic of the school pulled it toward the fire below. By midnight, her existence would be erased, unless she acted. The great iron bell hung silent for now. But she could almost hear its tolling in her imagination. 3 strikes that marked the end of every child swallowed by the flames. Isla knew she had little more than an hour before the ritual claimed her completely. She carried only her courage and the memory of those already taken, a memory that somehow remained with her when it left all others. She crept to the chapel, where the secret stair still yawned open from her discovery the night before. But this time, she was not alone. Standing before the opening was Headmaster Alistair Crowe, his tall figure shrouded in robes that seemed to blend with the stone itself. His face was pale and sharp, eyes glowing faintly with a firelight not of this world. "You should not be here, Isla McCrae," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle, though it carried a cold edge. "Your place is with the others. Do not fight what you cannot stop." Isla stepped forward, her fists clenched. "You're lying to them. To everyone. You say they are gone, but they are not gone. They are consumed." The headmaster's lips twitched into something between a smile and a grimace. Consumed, yes, but not lost. The fire preserves what the world would forget. Every child feeds it, strengthens it, sustains Dunmore Hall, so it endures when all else fades. Would you rather they were left to rot in graves, nameless and alone? The fire makes them eternal. Eternal? Isla spat the word, her voice shaking. No one remembers them. Not their parents, not their friends, not even the teachers. What kind of eternity is that? They are screaming down there, begging to be remembered. You've damned them, not saved them. For the first time, Crowe's composure faltered. His eyes narrowed, and his hands tightened over the ledger he carried. You know nothing of the pact. You think memory is salvation? No, child. Memory is weakness. Memory is pain. The fire takes the burden away. The bell began to toll, its sound rolling through the hall like thunder. Isla flinched but held her ground. The first strike echoed, shaking the windows. She felt her name burning in the ledger, her identity unraveling with each vibration of the bell. "If I burn knowing the truth," she said fiercely. "But I will not let you keep feeding it." With sudden strength, she lunged for the ledger. Crowe's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with unnatural force. The firelight from below surged, rising through the cracks in the chapel floor as if eager to witness the struggle. The second bell strike roared above them. Isla strained, her free hand clawing at the book, feeling the hot pulse of her name glowing inside. "Child," the headmaster hissed, "you cannot win. The fire already knows you. It has claimed you." But Isla looked into his eyes and saw it. Fear. Not of her, but of what she carried inside her, the one thing the fire could not take. Memory. She still remembered, when no one else did. That made her dangerous. That made her a threat. The third and final bell struck, and the chamber shook as the fire below roared in answer. Isla wrenched herself free, clutching at the ledger with desperate force. If she could destroy it, perhaps she could destroy the ritual itself. The headmaster shouted, his voice cracking with fury as the flames surged higher, licking at the stones. The confrontation had begun, and the fire was listening. The chapel shook as if the very stones of Dunmore Hall were alive. Fire roared beneath the floor, seeping through the cracks, reaching upward like claws desperate to drag everything above into its inferno. The black ledger burned in Isla's arms, its pages glowing with a heat that seared her skin. She knew she had only moments before the fire consumed not only her name but her body, her soul, her very existence. Headmaster Crow loomed across from her, his robes whipping in the unnatural wind that spiraled through the chamber. His face was no longer pale but lit with the same flickering blaze that rose from the pit below. His voice boomed like a sermon. "Give it to the fire, child. Give it what it is owed. Do not think you can undo centuries with a single act." But Isla stood firm, though her legs trembled. Around her, the chapel's stained glass windows shuddered, rattling in their frames. The saints painted on them seemed to weep as the fire's glow turned their holy faces into grotesque masks. She thought of the children whose laughter had once echoed in these halls, the twins from Edinburgh, her vanished friend, and countless others no one remembered. Their whispers had followed her here, begging, pleading. Her voice cut through the roar of the flames. "If I burn with them. But I will not let this place feed again." Crow's face twisted in fury. "You would destroy yourself for shadows? For voices that even their mothers no longer recall?" "They are not shadows," Isla shouted. "They are the only truth this place has left." With that, she threw the ledger into the pit. The book struck the flames, and the chamber erupted. The fire screamed, not crackling, not roaring, but screaming, a sound of countless voices bursting free at once. The walls buckled, beams split, and the floor beneath the headmaster crumbled. Crow stumbled forward, his arms reaching toward the fire as if embracing it, his mouth opening in rapture. He did not resist as the flames swallowed him whole. Isla was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. Heat seared her lungs, but she forced herself to her feet. Around her, she saw faces forming in the smoke, not tortured, not screaming, but free. Children's eyes, bright and familiar, gazed at her. 1,000 voices whispered in unison, "Thank you." She staggered toward the chapel doors. The fire surged higher behind her, licking at the rafters, climbing the walls. Every portrait in the abandoned wing, every hidden letter, every forgotten memory was being released, burned into light instead of ash. The cycle was breaking, but Isla knew the choice remained. If she stayed within Dunmore's walls, she would burn too, becoming one more ember in the memory of the fire. If she left, if she escaped into the moors with the dawn, she would carry the truth, and the world would finally hear what had been buried in silence for centuries. The bell above tolled once more, not 3 times but endlessly, its sound warped, frantic, as the tower collapsed. Isla pushed open the heavy doors, the night air rushing in, cool and pure against her scorched skin. She stumbled into the moors, her lungs aching, her body weak, but her mind clear. Behind her, Dunmore Hall was aflame, its windows glowing like the eyes of a dying beast. By dawn, the fire had devoured the school. All that remained was smoke, ash, and silence. Yet Isla stood beyond the gates, alive, the memory still intact within her. She had chosen not to be consumed. She had chosen to remember. And because of her, Dunmore's secret would never again remain in the dark.